Actually, I might bring in my next guest on this to start with. Liberal Senator James Paterson is here in the studio with me. What are you making of this royal visit so far? They seem to be received pretty well.
Tom, like you, I'm not a royal expert, but they're obviously a lovely young couple and nice to see them here in Australia for such a good cause in the Invictus Games.
Yeah, and that's, I think, very hard to fault Prince Harry when he comes here and he's getting a lot of profile to that. It's an event that stands on its own 2 feet these days, but he'll be up there later this week with the Prime Minister planting the flag on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and that gets underway, I think, this weekend is when the Invictus Games start. So, as you say, yes, certainly a very good cause, and we'll go back to our reporters later on this hour, I think, when they are expected to be at the local park, Victoria Park. They're a big picnic with a lot of locals. I reckon they'll be coming in from in and around Dubbo to catch a glimpse, to see them, but passing by, as they say. Let's get into a few of the political issues, though. First of all, James Paterson, you were in the Senate for this OK to be white motion.
No, I wasn't actually.
You weren't there?
No, I was on leave on Monday. For my sins, I was appearing on the Q&A program on ABC in Melbourne. So I wasn't there, and when I heard that afternoon that my colleagues had voted for it, I have to say I was surprised. I wasn't expecting that we would have voted for it.
So you were aware of this because there was a lot of media reports on September 19 about this?
Yeah, I was aware of it in the previous sitting week when it had been on the notice paper, and we didn't get to it on that final Thursday of the previous sitting week. And it was my expectation that we would be voting against the motion when it came to the Senate.
And one of the things that sort of perplexes people is that there's this talk of an email went out from Christian Porter's office, so people supported it. But don't senators look down and read it and think of the context and know who's moving it, and people were yelling across the aisle as well when we saw the vote happening?
We do, Tom, but in a major party we specialise and we focus on our own different areas, and we combine our resources as a team, and we trust the judgment of the whip or the manager or the relevant shadow minister or minister's office to make collective decisions on things like that. So most colleagues, if they sat there every day and went through the dozens and dozens of motions and decided their own individual position on each of those motions, we would do nothing else. We wouldn't do any of our committee work, we wouldn't do any of our constituents' work, we wouldn't contribute to the legislation debate. I mean, it would just take up so much of our time.
What about the motion itself? Did it have any merit, do you think?
Well, Tom, on the right and in the Liberal Party, we're often very critical.
I'm not sure if you're paired at the moment.
I am paired, thank you.
It's all good. Stand down, Jeffrey.
On the right, we're often very critical of the virtue signalling and the identity politics on the left. And my view is we have to be utterly consistent about that.
Right.
And when people on the right, and One Nation does do this from time to time, engage in their own virtue signalling with motions like this and engage in their own kind of white identity politics, we should reject that just as we reject the identity politics of the left.
What would you equate it to with the identity politics of the left that you mentioned?
Well, it's dividing people by race, Tom, and it's just not necessary in a country like Australia. Why should we be singling out any Australian on the basis of their race? We're all Australians. We don't need to single out any one group of us for separate treatment or a special motion for one group. I just think it's not the right thing to do.
Fair enough. Now, I guess you missed that vote. You're missing this one right now. But the pairing arrangement's always good. The Israel embassy, if we do this, how will it help the peace process?
It's a good question, Tom. The negotiating strategy of the Palestinian Authority in recent years has been to refuse to negotiate with Israel, and in the meantime try and generate enough international pressure to isolate Israel, to force Israel to make concessions that are more favourable to Palestine. Now, they're not concessions that the Israeli government can ever make or will ever make, and it's important when I think what Donald Trump has done, which is right, which is to say to the Palestinians, if you sit out the negotiating process, if you refuse to come to the negotiating table, events are going to continue to move on, and things might happen that are unfavourable to you, that you might dislike. Like I might recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and I might move the US embassy there. And what the message, the very strong message that is sent, is that you need to be engaged in the peace process. You need to come to the table, and you have to participate, because if you just sit it out, then the world's going to keep moving on.
Does it give the whip hand increasingly to Israel, though, in terms of those negotiations? Because you say the world's moving on, and it is. I mean, they're sort of creeping more and more into territory that was previously held, if you like, by Palestine. So that sort of creep's happening anyway.
Well, on the question of West Jerusalem, which is what we're talking about, this is uncontentious. It is where the Israeli Parliament is, where the Prime Minister's office and home is, where our diplomats go for meetings on a weekly and probably daily basis. It is where the business of government in Israel is conducted. And it is Israel's capital. The only question is, should we persist with the fiction? Should we pretend that it's not really Israel's capital? Should we pretend another city to the north is actually Israel's capital? Well, I don't think there's any value in pretending when we know what the truth is.
Is it going to be worth it if it costs us a free trade deal with Indonesia?
I'd be very surprised if it cost us a free trade agreement, Tom, because there's very good reasons for Indonesia to have that free trade agreement, just as there are very good reasons for Australia to have that agreement. It's in both our interests.
But we're hearing noises out of Indonesia. If that becomes the threat, well, this is out if that's what you do with your embassy. Should we listen to that threat?
Well, Tom, as far as I'm aware, there's been one report speculating about what the Indonesian government might do, and that's been contradicted by multiple on-the-record comments by Indonesian officials. So I don't believe that is a concern. And on a more profound and broader point, Indonesia and Australia have a great and close relationship, and this trade agreement is very close to us. But we don't seek to dictate to Indonesia what its foreign policy should be in respect to the Middle East, and we wouldn't expect them to dictate to us what our foreign policy in the Middle East should be.
So if they were trying to do that, we should perhaps on principle say we can talk everything you want to do with the deal and the things you like and don't like about it, but we're not going to mix the two issues?
Well, there's no evidence that they are, only speculation. But of course, Australia is a sovereign nation and we determine our own foreign policy.
And we shouldn't be bullied then by that?
Well, I don't think there is any bullying. There's no evidence of any bullying.
Well, we do have these reports out, and these appear to come from senior government sources.
Well, I've only seen one, and it amounted to speculation to me, and it appeared to be on just a single source, and that single source has been contradicted by on-the-record comments. So
you'd be worried, though, on principle, if we were going to back away from a foreign policy decision based on an unrelated threat.
Well, there's no evidence that we will, and there's no reason to believe that we will. Australia determines our own foreign policy independently.
All right. Just finally, the asylum deal that's been spoken about. It seems to have had a bit of cold water poured over it by both sides, really. But this legislation that the government wants to get through before considering a New Zealand resettlement deal, it would ban anyone that tried to come to Australia by boat from ever coming to the Australia, even for a two-day conference as the example. Why does it need to be that strong?
Well, Tom, it needs to be that strong because it was not an easy task to fix the damage that was done to our border protection policies by the previous government. We all know the human misery, the financial costs that happened there. And while everyone is very empathetic to the people on Nauru, and all of my colleagues would like there to be no asylum seekers on Nauru, we cannot allow solving that issue, which I think is an important one, to come at the cost of our very strong border protection policies. And this is one thing which might help us do that. And so I hope the Labor Party would reconsider their opposition.
But what it seems to sort of depend upon is that you need to ban people from ever coming here. Now, why couldn't we have legislation that bans people from being resettled here instead?
Well, Tom, I'm not privy to the exact details.
Isn't that the sugar on the table?
Well, no, the very important thing is we don't want human traffickers to be able to say to potential asylum seekers, look, the Australian government said you were never going to be able to go there, but actually, look, we've found a loophole, we've found a back door, we'll get you to New Zealand instead, and then once you're in New Zealand, you'll be able to come to Australia, you'll be able to visit regularly.
This is about if the legislation stops people from being able to resettle there, that's what the government has always said wouldn't happen. That's what Labor always said wouldn't happen. It wasn't that no one could ever set foot on Australian soil.
Well, but I think, Tom, it would undermine the whole purpose of it. If you could become a permanent resident of New Zealand, for example, and you could be in Australia every weekend, if you like, you could study in Australia, you could work in Australia with all the rights that New Zealand residents and citizens have.
So New Zealand should be off the table full stop then?
Well, no, it should be... I mean, it's something that the government will consider, but only in the context of this legislation being passed. We can't consider it until that's passed.
James Paterson, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.